Hello, everyone. I am Mohammad Tavakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to the inaugural session of the Institute's Zoroastrian Studies Seminar Series, which I am co-convening with my colleagues, Professor Enrico Raffaelli and Professor Miguel Angel Andres Toledo, the Faizana Professor of Zoroastrian Languages and Literatures at the University of Toronto. We are grateful to the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute, the Encyclopaedia Iranica Foundation, the Zoroastrian Federation of North America, and Zoroastrian Society of Ontario for co-sponsoring this monthly lecture series. At the outset, I'd like to express our solidarity with the inspiring women's movement in Iran and our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. I welcome Professor Alberto Cantera to the University of Toronto. Today, Professor Cantera is speaking on the conception and representation of Zoroastrian rituals. My colleague, Professor Miguel Angel Andres Toledo, will introduce our distinguished colleague and will moderate today's session. Professor Andres Toledo, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Tavakkoli. It is a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Alberto Cantera. Professor Alberto Cantera is the full professor of Iranian Studies at the Freie Universität Berlin at the Institute for Iranistic. He's one of the most renowned scholars in the field of Zoroastrian studies. He has contributed in the last decades with some of the most important, most relevant publications in the field. I had the honor also of working with him many, many years. He was also my supervisor at the University of Salamanca before he moved to his new position in Berlin. We have been working together and in contact many times. He's an authority in the field, as you will see also in his presentation, and among his many, many publications, hundreds of articles, he has some of the most important books also published in the field in the last years, like, for instance, Studien zur Pahlavi-Übersetzung, Studies to the Pahlavi Translation, one of the most relevant books in this field. Another monograph that was some years ago published in French, in this case in French, Vers une édition de la liturgie langue zoroastrienne, a very important contribution in the study of the Zoroastrian literature, and particularly the Zoroastrian written and oral transmission. And in order not to make it too long, please, Alberto, that's your university now. Welcome to the University of Toronto. The floor is yours. The screen is yours. Thank you very much for participating today.
So thank you very much, Miguel Angel, for this presentation, and thank you very much, Professor Tavakkoli and for Professor Raffaelli and Miguel Angel for the invitation and for giving me the occasion of opening this Zoroastrian seminar series and presenting some of my research in the last years. The topic I'm approaching today is a topic on which I have been working in the last years, and I have presented it in various different ways in the last year, many times, so in written form, also in presentations. So maybe some of you might have might know part of the contents, but I hope that I will add some new insights in some points, also new aspects that you might consider. And for the people that don't know my work of the last years, I hope that it is a good overview of what we are doing and which are the changes in the conception of the Zoroastrian rituals that we are trying to achieve in the last years. So I will share my presentation. I will directly begin. Let me see if I can.
Good to go.
Okay, so in the last years, there have been a series of changes in the conception of the Avestan text, first, and second, on the relationship of the Avestan text to the Zoroastrian rituals that are still performed in the present times. And these changes have been triggered by, in my opinion, by four milestones in the research in the last years. I would say the first one was the beginning of a deconstruction of the model of the traditional model of the transmission of the Avestan text that was initiated by Jean Kellens with an article, with his famous article, Considérations sur l'histoire de l'Avesta from 1996. The second one is the publication of a new edition and translation of the Nerangestan, a meta-ritual text of probably the end of the Sasanian times or early Islamic centuries. And this text has been edited and translated by Kotval and Krayenbroek in the last years, and have offered for the first time a translation that is understandable. This text was useless, more or less, for us before, and now it is a fully comprehensible text that offers new insights for the history of the Zoroastrian rituals. The third one is, I think, the accessibility to the liturgical manuscripts. The liturgical manuscripts have been misrepresented. So the Avestan manuscripts are divided in two groups that describe the liturgies as they are performed, and groups that include only the Avestan text with some translations in different languages. And the second ones were the ones that were basically used for the edition of the long liturgy in the editions of the 19th century, and are also the ones that are better represented in the facsimiles that were published during the 20th century. So that very little, if some, liturgical manuscripts of the Avestan text were known before the beginning of the Avestan Digital Archive, which is a project that I started in 2008, where I have been working together with Miguel Angel. So we started it together in Salamanca now almost 15 years ago. And there a lot of new liturgical manuscripts have been published and are accessible for the first time, so that we know today very good the descriptions of the performance of the Zoroastrian main liturgies since the 14th century until the present day. So we have a more or less continuous witness of the performance of the liturgies during these centuries, and we can also trace back the history and the changes that had happened along these centuries. And the last one is, I think, a new conception of the intercalation ceremonies, and I will mention this shortly later, but I think this offered us the possibility of understanding the position of texts, of Avestan texts that are not directly related to the ritual, and gave us the possibility to understand them as part of the ritual. And so we got to a new conception of the Avestan text. Which is the problem? The main problem is that the text that we have, the Avestan texts that are still used in the liturgies, and that are basically, these are basically the same that appear in the manuscripts, do not fit with the description of the Avesta that we find in the tradition, in the Zoroastrian tradition, since the Pahlavi literature through the Rivayats and until the 18th century. So this tradition represent an Avesta of 21 Nask, and these Nask are not reflected or not directly reflected in the text that we find in the liturgies. And the problem between this, of the relationship between these two entities. So on the one side, the Avestan texts that are still used in the liturgies and that appear in the manuscripts, and the descriptions of the Avesta is one of the main problems of the Avestan transmission. The traditional view is that the rituals, also that the Avestan, the ritual use of the Avestan text is secondary. This view goes already to the first translator of the Avesta. This is Anquetil de Perron, and he has taken over from the Parsis. And the idea is that the arrangement of the Avesta in 21 books is the original one, and from this arrangement, a few texts were selected for liturgies. And this is an idea that in different variations have survived until today. Even within this frame, we find different models of transmission. And well, I would say that the most traditional one is the one that you can see in this slide, is that in the antiquities, or let's say Achaemenid time, there were some texts and maybe some rituals also, and some of them were transmitted after Alexander and reached into the to the Parthian and Sasanian times, and then recovery of these texts, or the few surviving texts were started, and from this recovery, the result of this recovery would be the 21 Nask of the Avesta, that is, as they are described in the Pahlavi literature, and the rituals that we have are extracted from this great Avesta and were later creations. So even in the Sasanian times, or most likely, also most people thought even after the Islamization. So you see, for example, this quotation from Gelna, what he says, the compilation of the textbook Yasna might have been undertaken even at a very late period, and he means after the Sasanian time. This model was challenged by Kellens in the article that I mentioned, and you see here which is the problem. And so the main problem of Kellens is that he was against the derivation of the Avestan text for the rituals from the Great Avesta. And he said that at least since the Sasanian times, these two collections are two parallel collections, one that we know, the ritual collection, and another one that we don't know. It is described there, but it has no other reality for us than these descriptions that you find in the Pahlavi literature, so that the Great Avesta becomes like incognita, an incognitum, and is not relevant for the research. The research of the Avestan text doesn't have to concern with the reality described in the Pahlavi literature. The model I propose is a completely different one, and today I will shortly deal with this. Is not my main part of the talk, but let me explain shortly my idea. The idea I try to defend is that there was at the end, also already in Achaemenid times, a series of rituals, and there is a ritual, a continuous ritual tradition that has been continued until the Sasanian times and even until the modern times, and that these rituals, of course, changed partly, and some rituals disappeared and so on, but these rituals survived until the Sasanian times, and that the Great Avesta, and this is the key, that's the key, the Great Avesta was extracted from the ritual. So the Great Avesta doesn't have a parallel reality, but it is a conscious arrangement of some liturgical text in a different arrangement for other purposes. So instead of deriving the rituals from the Great Avesta, my model is to derive the Great Avesta from the rituals. This is basically the model that I have, and the main arguments are, on the one side, the antiquity of the rituals, and on the other side, my understanding of the function of these rituals of intercalation, a point that I will also explain shortly in a few minutes. But let's, I have decided to do it earlier now. So the problem is we have in the Avesta a certain text that do not seem to have a ritual frame. So like the Videv, that it describes rituals of purification, etc., but it is not to be recited during, but it hasn't have the direct performative information about the ritual in which the Videvdat is recited. In fact, the Videvdat is recited within the long liturgy, within the ceremony of the Visperat, but this has been considered usually as a late creation in order to create even each time more complex rituals. And this is the idea already by Anquetil, that it says there is a tendency of the Zoroastrians to make rituals bigger and bigger through combination, but it shouldn't be an old feature. I tried to show that these intercalation rituals are a very essential feature of the Zoroastrian rituals already in antiquity, and that most of the texts that are not explicitly ritual, but these interviews between Zarathustra and Ahura Mazda mostly, but also sometimes between Zarathustra and Vistaspa and other figures, they were conceived for being intercalated in the long liturgy, and that the long liturgy serves as a frame for the intercalation of these interviews between Zarathustra and Ahura Mazda. This is the one point. The other point is the antiquity of the rituals, and this is a key point, and how to show that these rituals that usually are considered to have been created sometimes in Sasanian times or even after the Sasanian times have a certain antiquity. So the first point is today that we can compare the Nerangestan with the manuscripts, we see that there is a extremely strong continuity between the performances as are described in the Nerangestan and the performances that are described in the Safavid times, for example, or even later. So I have put just here an example. I don't want to extend it, but if you compare the chapter 28 of the Nerangestan with the performance of Videvdat ceremony as it is described in the manuscripts, in the Iranian manuscripts, you will notice that there is almost no differences, and the differences are minimal, and most of them they are easy to be explained. So you see here all these instructions that you see here in black, from all of them are common instructions, and they are only these the ones in red are the ones in which there are some slight differences between the performance in Safavid times and the performance in the Nerangestan. So it is clear that the ceremonies that were performed in the Safavid times is still in a very similar way as they were performed in Sasanian times. This doesn't mean yet that these rituals, that were performed in the Sasanian times, go back to the early antiquity, but I think that we have some signs that point into this direction. First is that some of the ritual instructions that have a continuation even in Safavid times, for these instructions we have also Avestan instructions saying exactly the same. So, for example, the exact way of pounding hauma and so on. There are several ritual instructions that confirm that some details of the performance go back to the antiquity. But again, it does not mean that the rituals as whole go back to the antiquity. The most clear evidence for me from the Nerangestan is provided by this passage, and this is a passage in the chapter 84 of the Nerangestan, describing how to deal with the varsom, with the varesman, with these twigs that are used in the Zoroastrian rituals. And there they are mentioned the 7 moments of the liturgy during which the varsom has to be spread. And these 7 moments are mentioned exactly in the same order as they appear in a performance of a Visperat ceremony. So the composer of this Avestan instruction about the spreading of the varsom had in mind exactly the same textual, or basically the same textual arrangement of the Visperat ceremony as we have it today. And even the moments in which the varsom has to be spread, at least some of them, they agree with the most central moments in which the Val song is still today spread, which is basically at the beginning of Yasna 14, and then after the attacks in Yanis. And they are two key moments for the Val song in the modern ceremonies, and they are also already mentioned in this Avestan Nerangestan. There are other arguments that I will mention later, but derived from the Nerangestan, basically these are the two. So agreement in some details, and then the evidence that the textual arrangement of the Bisperat was already known to someone who has composed a Nerang in Avestan. This continuity does not mean that all the rituals that are performed today were already performed in antiquity. Of course, we will see that the system of the Zoroastrian rituals allows productivity, and it doesn't mean that everything remains exactly the same. There have been important changes in the history of the rituals, and I just mentioned here some of the headlines but each one could be developed in a separate talk. So, for example, internal changes, so like the progressive alienation of the ritual world from the real world that leads to a schematization of the ritual, the external changes like the transformation of the ritual landscape, the reduction of the number of rituals. We see clearly that already between the Nerangestan and the Safavid times, there is a reduction of the number of rituals that are performed. And again, from the Safavid times to the modern times and so on, and this reduction continues still today. And we see also the transformation of certain rituals into prayer, so that the ritual performance is abandoned and they become just texts that can be recited without any ritual performance accompanying this ritual. So continuity doesn't mean does not mean that everything remains exactly the same. You have always a tension between continuity and change, but it means only that there was never a complete break in the tradition. This is my my point. And so, and another argument at the same time, so the approach of seeing the Zoroastrian rituals as an old creation, so and not as a modern patchwork, allows us to look into the rituals from a different perspective and to see them in a different way. And also this will show, as I will try to demonstrate, that the antiquity of the rituals, the traditional conception of the complex of the Zoroastrian rituals of the Avestan texts used in the rituals is basically that essentialistic and jasna-centric. What do I mean with this? So they conceive each single Avestan text as a unit different from all the others, and basically the texts that are considered to exist are the Yazd, the Yasna, and the Bidevdat. The Yazd are, even in the conception of boys, pre-Zoroastrian. The Yasna would be the purely Zoroastrian thing, and the Bidevdat would be a late Parthian creation. So from this text are extracted all the rituals. And you see, for example, the Dronyas in these quotations that I mentioned, they are from Geltner or also from Stausberg, is just said that the drone, which is the basic unit, the basic ritual unit that we have in the Zoroastrian ritual system, is just an extraction from the Yasna, or that the Visperat is just an increasing and more or less nonsensic increasing of the Yasna and so on. Instead of this, we have come to the idea that the rituals show a great modularity and that we have different modules that can be combined in a different way. And this system, the modular system, was certainly created when Avestan was still a living language, because it is impossible to create this system with Avestan being an already dead language. You can keep it productive after the death of the Avestan language, but the moment of the creation has to be an old one. And so, and the basic structure of each Zoroastrian ritual, and almost all Avestan texts, they share this structure, is that you have a frame, at the beginning, an initial and a final frame, and a central part. The initial frame, the main part of the initial frame is the fravarane, in which it is announced the type of ceremony that is going to be performed, the time for the ceremony, and the divinity for which the ceremony is performed. And this is resumed at the end in the frame, in the end frame with the Jasnencha, Vachnencha formula, and so on. And the central part is also modular. And we have a typology of this central part, and we can divide it basically into different groups. One, the ceremonies with litanies, and the other one, the ceremonies with litanies. What is a litany? Is the repetition of a long list of ratus and yasatas, also of times and patrons of these times, of these liturgical times, and of different yasatas, also divinities of the pantheon, repeated with different verbs, and that represent different ritual moments. The rituals, also all the Western texts, can be divided basically in these two groups: the ones that include litanies and the one without litanies. And the one with litanies can be divided in the ones that are monolitanic, so the ones that have only a series of litanies, and the ones that are plurilitanic, the ones that have several litanies. And the second one is what I call the long liturgy, which is what usually is called the Yasna, Vispera, Videvtat, and so on. And the monolitanic is basically the drone system. Then the rituals without litanies basically can be affirmed that they can be combined, and mostly they were recited in complex liturgies in which they were combined with the rituals with litanies. And why is that? This is because it is in the litanies where you are able to announce again the same things that you announce in the fravarane, like the time for the performance, the day of the performance, the divinity for which the ceremony is celebrated, and so on. So we have this distinction of the money, and well, I will skip this. And this distinction between monolitanic rituals, plurilitanic rituals, and rituals without litanies is not only a description that we can make a posteriori, but it is clear that it was already recognized by the creators of the rituals. We see it because all this is announced already in the Avestan text itself, and the Avestan text tell us which kind of ritual it is, and depending if it is a monolitanic or a plurilitanic, it shares, or a non-litanic ritual, it shares some features in the textual features far beyond the simple presence or absence of the litanies. So, for example, I have mentioned it several times. I will repeat it only very shortly for the ones that don't know. We have the fravarane, for example, already announced if it is a plurilitanic ceremony or not. Then in the list of the temporal ratus that appears in all the litanies, it is already announced if it is a plurilitanic or a monolitanic litany with different features. And it's also clear that they have different functions. So the monolitanic ceremonies are conceived for all the gods, for Vispayasata. The ceremonies without litanies, they are only for one divinity or a specific group of divinities. And the Visparatu, also the plurilitanic ceremonies, they have a different function. They are universal litanies that are valid for all times and for all divinities. So it is a gradation there, and it's not just a purely formal division. Furthermore, through this modular system allows us to understand how the system of producing rituals works. So we have different modules that can be combined in different ways, creating each time more complex structures. I have here represented some a basic model, but I don't think that I have the time to explain it. It's just to show you that The modules can be minimal modules, just a few words designation, for example, of different offerings, and this is mobile depending on the offering. This text appear or not appeared, then or list of divinities or days, months, and so on. But you have also complete stanzas that have special functions and can be used in different litanies or not be used, and so on. Then you have the single litany, then you have the multiple litany. The multiple litanies can also be repeated. A whole combination of a multiple litany with a poetic text after it can be also combined in different bigger and bigger unities. Different liturgies can be combined and are combined in a bigger and bigger and more complex liturgies, and so on. This is a system that can be combined ad infinitum, more or less. The point is, this modular system allows the priest to introduce changes in the liturgies without knowing Avestan, so without being able to compose new text in Avesta. So if since we have this module system, you can, for example, remove an offering if the offering is no longer offered. This is very clearly, for example, the case in Yasnathi 3.3, when you listed the libations to the waters. When the solid libation to the waters, this Gamba Oirian, was abandoned, then the Avestan text was removed. But still, the Indian text have this module, and this Indian tradition that shows this module didn't arise before the 13th century. So that means in the at the 13th century, the priests were able to eliminate some parts because they considered that this object is no longer offered. Then the corresponding Avestan text has to be removed. So the text remain alive also in modern times. This offers, of course, the problem of the chronology. And another aspect of this modularity is that you can create easy new rituals at any time. And it is a system that is extremely productive, especially in the ceremonies that are rituals without litanies. Now, the productivity in this area seems to be very big, and so the problem for assessing a chronology there is huge. And the elements that we have, the criteria that we can mention for trying to establish a chronology of some rituals are first the date of attestation in the manuscripts or the mention in other works. This is sometimes very useful because some rituals seem to be really very modern and have appeared even in the times of the when the written transmission is already known to us. On the other hand, we have the structural analysis and also the linguistic analysis, and I will show you two examples some examples of this. The structural analysis, this is very interesting, and this is for the case of the stone. Probably some of you know what is the stone. The stone is a short ceremony for the phrabasis, which is more or less in relationship to the Farrokhsi, and the Farrokhsi is the combination of a drone, also a multiple litany, with the just 13 of the just 13, the Frabardinyas. The stone is only the recitation of a part of the litanies of the Farrokhsi. And this part is especially the dedication to the phrabasis. But it is quoted, it is recited in a way that includes some elements that we know, because we now understand how the structure functions, that these elements belong only to monolithanic rituals, and the litany is not included, but it is clear that it is a late creation by someone who already did not understand how the system works. So the stone is a late creation. How late, we cannot know. We can just say it is attested in the oldest attestation that we know is in the manuscript K38, so it has to be created before the date of this manuscript, but it is all that we can say about the antiquity of this ritual. For sure, it doesn't go back to the antiquity. Another tool is the linguistic analysis of single pieces. And this is very interesting. For example, there is a very interesting example. And this is a very interesting feature of these multilitanic rituals that are created for the eternal time, more or less. It is that they quote the last stanza of the Mir-Djalali always before the date. And this happens only in this specific type of rituals. When the stanza has to be recited in a litany that needs the gods to be in accusative, then it is easy to do the transformation, because the last stanza of the Mir-Djalali is a Yazamaide stanza, as we worship Mitra and Ahura and so on, and they just have to change the verb, but the accusatives remain. But in some other litanies, like this Ayavadayamahi litany, they have to transform it into the genitive dative. And this is for them already impossible. The genitive and dative of the stars and the moon and the sun are wrong in this adaptation. Although in other parts of the litanies, this is done perfectly without any problems. So that we can know that at the moment of the adaptation of the Mir stanza in the long liturgy, they were no longer able to compose new Avestan texts, and they were even not very capable of making right adaptations. This is very interesting because probably, and this is my view, this mention of Mithra immediately before the date has to be connected, or could be connected, with the introduction with the solar calendar and with the raising of Mithra as an important figure in the frame of this reform of the liturgical calendar into a solar calendar. So if this is true, we could say that at the time when the solar calendar was introduced, they were probably no longer able of producing new correct Avestan text. So the other aspect that another interesting point that offers on this seeing the rituals as a living system, that it is as it is indeed, is that it is a dynamic system. So the rituals are not one. The yasna is not one yasna. The yasna changes depending on the day of recitation, on the divinity for which it is recited, and so on. And well, I think I have moved my slides, but here, for example, you see a variation. So the variations are not always purely very simple. Sometimes they are complex variation, and here you have, for example, an important variation that happens in the performance of the Abzocher at the moment when during the performance, immediately before the performance of the Abzocher, when the yasna is performed in the Frabardigan days. And there are many other variations, and these variations have never been analyzed, were completely unknown until we have started our analysis of all the ritual, of all the liturgical manuscripts, and also of the informations contained in the Persian riwayats. Another important point is that we have learned also that the Avestan texts are linked to the performance. So these Avestan texts were not created independently of the performance, but they were created for the performance. And this is seen, this can be seen in many aspects, but perhaps the most clear one is the litanies, when we have a series of performative verbs, and I distinguish there two different kind of performative verbs. So the one that are referential to a simultaneous action, like the verbs ayese yesti or ayvadayamahi, that are simultaneous to the action that it is done at the same time. So for example, ayvadayamahi refers to the moment of lifting, raising the offerings in your hands and offering it to the gods. But there are other verbs that are proper performative verbs or speech act verbs like yazamaide or azaya dadami that refers also that don't refer to an action that it is carried out exactly at the same time, but this is the action in itself is the pronunciation of the verb. So but this is an aspect, but which is another thing that I wanted to emphasize today is this convention that the texts were composed for the performance allows us to look at the text from a different point of view and to pay attention to things that never had been considered. For example, the use of the ictic pronouns, the use of personal pronouns, and so on. And I have here a very nice example of the use of the pronoun of the second person singular. And this pronoun in the liturgy, it is used out of the gathas and the homestom, where the pronoun is used in the homestom for Hauma and in the gathas for Ahura Mazda, but also for other entities. The second person singular pronoun is used in the whole liturgy, always only for the fire. And there is only one exception, and this exception it happens between Yasna 60C2 and Yasna 68:15. This observation, combined with some information in the Nerangestan and with the description of the rituals in the Safavid times, allows me to make the hypothesis that the priest in the antiquity abandoned the presence of the fire at this specific moment and goes to the water for the performance of the libation to the waters. And if you look to the picture of some Sasanian temples, you see that the fire chamber is always very close to the water basin or to the Anahita temple or whatever you want. So for me, it's clear that in Sasanian times, and this is it can be supported with evidence from the Nerangestan too, the priest abandoned, at this moment of the Absocher, the priest abandoned the fire chamber, went to the water, the libations took place directly on the water, and then he went back to the fire chamber and addressed again the fire with the second person singular and so on. So we could give other examples. So the convention that the texts were created for the ritual performance allows us to look at the text from another perspective and to make a new reading of the text and to learn even more about the performance in the antiquity too, and to see how it is connected with the performance in the Sasanian times and in the modern times. And the goal of all this is to be able at the very end of writing a history of the Zoroastrian rituals from the antiquity until the modern times. So this new conception, and I will finish now because it's the time, is what we try to represent in our long-term project, which is the Corpus Avesticum Verolinense, in which we try to edit all these Avestan texts from a new perspective. And this allows you to see the rituals in their dynamism. So, for example, let me show you some details of the web page. So you can also, the rituals are not do not exist as such. There is not a yasna or there is not a visperat, but you can always generate the specific yasna that you want for a specific deity and for a specific day and for a specific month and a specific time of the day. And then you generate it, and it is generated each time anew. So here I have, for example, a Vesperat ceremony already generated because it takes a few seconds to generate the ceremony. And the other important aspect is that you get the information here. For example, if we take each example that you take here, you see also the performative information. So the instructions that are performed in the that are mentioned in the manuscripts, and here you have one just one instruction of one manuscript already transcribed and translated. But in the, let me see here if I can if you go here, you will get also in this more elaborate context, you see also other variations in other rituals, also the information about the modern performance, thanks to the book by Redar and Darubala with the translation of the Gujarati inscriptions. Sometimes we also add information from other Pahlavi works or from the Nerangestan. Sometimes the variations in the manuscripts are not just one, but many, so you can have even until 5, 6 different variations of the instructions in the manuscripts, and all of them are collected here, and you can see all of them for all the variants of the long liturgy already presented in this in our web page. The web page has also other tools, and so that I can show you if you want after during the questions or. But I think it is the time now are the more or less the 15 minutes that I promised to talk are gone, and so I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to receive your questions.
Thank you very much, Alberto, for this wonderful talk, which of course I'm sure will have a lot of questions in the Q&A time, which we can open right now. So we had 2 questions in the chat. So let me just read them quickly. The first of them by Navas Merchant. Since language does change, is it not possible that at the time, I guess, when the solar calendar became used, the grammar use also evolved from the earlier version?
Mm-hmm. So, well, the point is not just an evolution. They are just mistakes that can be traceable. So we know, of course, they are influenced by the evolution of language. And you see, if I might go, but well, it is too complex. But in the case, so we see how it happens. And the point is, even if it is a grammatical evolution, it is a grammatical evolution that is different from the one that we see in other parts of the litany. So this is clear. The adaptation of this stanza was done at a later moment than the conception of the litanies as such. And if you call them mistakes or modern variants, well, this is another question, but that it is a complete a living Avestan language with this new grammar is something that I doubt, but well, we could think about. Yeah.
Thank you. More questions? If not, in the meanwhile, there is another one in the chat by Zal Talayerhan. How different are the variations you just mentioned towards the end of your lecture?
Which kind of variations? The variations, the dynamic, also the synchronic variations within its liturgy, or variation, the chronological, the diachronic variation? Which kind of variation do you mean?
Can you please specify in the liturgy and chronological versions?
Also diachronic, the diachronic changes. So we can follow up very well the changes. I finishing now my critical edition of the Nerangs. And in the introduction, I'm trying to do for the first time a systematic analysis of each moment of the long liturgy, comparing all the evidences we have, the internal evidence from the Avestan text on the one side, second, the external evidence from the Nerangestan, the Avestan Nerangestan and the Pahlavi Nerangestan, third, the information in all the manuscripts, and the latest compared with the modern performance. And we see that there's, of course, there are important changes in the liturgy, like the reduction of the number of priests, or the abandon of the animal sacrifice before the Safavid times. But out of this big changes. The liturgy remains basically the same between the Nerangestan and the Safavid times, but at the same time in Iran, but at the same time in India, and this is something that Selim Redar and Kerman Daruvala are working on, and I hope very much that they can show soon results, because it requires to analyze the Gujarati ritual instructions of the manuscript that were produced also during the Safavid time, and this is a work that they are starting doing now. This is something that it is not yet done, and this analysis can't be done with detail. But if we compare it with the modern Indian practice, we see that there are significant differences in detail. So the main frame remains the same, but almost in each single action, there are differences in the modern Indian practice and the Iranian practice in Safavid time that mostly continues quite faithfully the Sasanian tradition. And this is one point. And the other point is, as far as we can judge, so I have really sometimes with help of Kotbar, with Zelin, or Dan Sheffield, sometimes I have compared some specific Nerans, and we see that already in the 16th century, there were important differences between the Indian practice and the Iranian practice. So the differences in the Indian practice today can be traced back probably some centuries ago.
Thank you very much. We have also Manek Bushbala. Can you please unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. I just had a question. You know, one of your slides, you have the title Fire Worship and Water Worship. Now, you know, we probably can understand it in the proper perspective that that does not mean that we are fire worshippers or water worshippers. But, you know, this if some non-Zoroastrians, you know, they might, you know, point that out as, you know, Zoroastrians had many gods and worship many gods, right? So is it possible to differentiate by using another term, say, reverence for fire, reverence for water, or praise for fire and praise for water?
Well, you know, so the use of the word worship is more or less conventional. I would prefer to use other, and it is true that these ceremonies are referred, also what is important to them is to give zauthra, to give these offerings, and is not the verb yazamaide, which is important there, which is the verb that it is. But the complex of the dedications in the ceremonies is huge. So a ceremony, a long liturgy, for example, is always dedicated first to the fire, then to the single divinities. And the single divinities are always preceded by, or almost always preceded by Ahura Mazda and the Amesha Spenta, and then the specific divinity for which this ceremony is performed. But then single parts of the ceremony can also be dedicated to other divinities. So, and what is clear for me is that already in the Yasna and the Visperat, as they are conceived, as in the Avestan Yasna and Visperat, we see that it can be conceived as two successive moments of worship of the fire, or reverence, if you want, to the fire and to the water, and then at the end of the ceremony again. So, for example, in the Vispera, the first Yasna Haptan Haiti is conceived by the young Avestan composers of the Vispera as a fire ceremony. The second recitation of the Yasna Haptan Haiti is conceived as a water ceremony. And this pattern is repeated again at the end, where you have the Atachniaisen and the Absochel at the end of the ceremony. But well, I get your point, and I can easily renounce to the word worship. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Armaiti.
Hi, thank you so much for this really informative talk. This is my first insight into what you were saying, and what fascinated me was your modular representation.
Mhm.
If I can say it in layman's terms, I'm wondering, it's almost like you're a chef if you are a priest in those 8 times, where you can pick and choose different ingredients to create this ritual or this meal. Now, what I'm wondering is modern implications. If someone was well-versed enough, like you showed us on the website, could we pick and choose and create our own ritual? Is that what you're saying?
Basically, yes. So you could create new rituals, and it has been happening for a long time. So small rituals are very easy. These so-called nerangs, so they are more or less magical spells. So for specific purposes, I don't know if you have stomach ache or whatever, you can pick a small but even the transformation of the big rituals, also we don't know when it stops. And you see, for example, so cases like Yasna 14, which is different in India and in Iran. So it seems that even after the separation of the community, they were introducing important changes in the performance of the main rituals. So, and of course, they don't compose any new text in the 16th century, but they can pick up modules and they know how to combine them, and they know these combinatory rules so that they can create and modify the system rituals. Yeah, this is the advantage of this modular system. Yeah.
One addendum then to, thank you so much, is that then as a modern community, as we evolve, this goes to show that, things don't have to be done exactly how they were 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago. You are showing there was evolution already taking place, and that it was logical, or it seemed to make sense and go with what was important at the time, rather than just blindly reciting the same things and not understanding them.
Yeah, I stayed at the level of description, but descriptively you can easily say that there is change and evolution, of course. And of course, the other advantage is, the semantic attachment of rituals is very loose. So you can attach almost every semantic to any ritual. So, and this is the reason why rituals can remain more or less stable, because semantics can change without changing the ritual. So, of course, even if the ritual remains the same, you can change its semantic, and it happens also. There are very little information in the Zoroastrian sources about the semantics of ritual. Also, there are some interpretations of single gestures. But it's not something that it is very much developed. And it doesn't taking into account the importance of the ritual within the Zoroastrian tradition. The semantics of the ritual is not so far developed as we could expect. But even in the few cases where we see semantics being attached to certain rituals, we see also their important evolution. So the evolution is there in the semantics, the possibility of evolution in the actions, and also the possibility of evolution even in the text shape. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Fred Mirza, please, can you unmute?
Yes, sir. Thank you for taking my questions. A quick one. You mentioned about the younger Avesta, and you mentioned that some of the rituals from the Achaemenid times were still around during the Sasanian times. Can we then deduce that the so-called younger Avesta is post-Achaemenian or around that time? Any dateline that we can fix on the difference between the younger and the ancient Avesta?
So we don't have any sure tools for telling when Avestan did stop to be a living language. So, and when they stopped to compose Avestan text. There are only a few general observations. So it is clear that in Sasanian times, the priestly language was no longer Young Avestan, but Pahlavi. So if they were able to speak Avestan in somehow, or to compose on Avestan text, well, then one wonders why they were using usually Pahlavi. So it is not to be, it cannot definitively be excluded, but it is just an indication that it is not the start. The other point is some more refined analysis, like for example, this that I did with the introduction of the Mithra stanza. But the problem is, of course, the chronology of the addition of this stanza is also speculative. So we don't have a certain day when we know. So this was certainly included in Achaemenid times, or I might speculate, and I do, that it is connected with the introduction of the solar calendar, but it remains a speculation, nothing conclusive that I can affirm that Avestan, and other arguments like that the states of the language is more or less similar to Young Avestan. Well, this is also irrelevant because sacred languages can survive longer in a more archaic type and so on. So it is an assumption, it is a hypothesis. I think it is also the most likely hypothesis that Avestan stopped to be productive with the Achaemenid period, but it is not something that can be affirmed with certainty. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, to Professor Cantera for this lecture, to all the speakers who also participated in the Q&A. And I'm sorry that there were some other questions, but we don't have much more time. We have to finish here. And please let me remind you that we will have the continuation of the Zoroastrian Studies Seminar Series on Friday, February 17 at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, with Professor Almut Hintze, who will talk on the transmission of the Zoroastrian texts. So please, let me thank Professor Cantera again and all participants for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you to you all for your attention.
Thank you again.
I just want to thank Professor Cantera once again for your outstanding presentation. And thank you, Professor Andres Toledo, for moderating today's session. And thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you on February 17th for another exciting lecture. Have a great day.